Hello once again, everyone, and welcome to our event tonight. I just saw in the comments all the different places people are watching from. Thank you so much. As I said before, my name is Andrea, and I work on the marketing team at the Strand. We're very happy to have everyone here tonight. But before we launch into our discussion with Julian, I'd like to share a little bit about the history of the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor. Now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support, because without our loyal community of book lovers, we wouldn't be where we are today. And also an update on the store, in case you're curious, the physical store in Union Square is open. We've been open for about 2 weeks, so wear a mask and stop by if you're in the area. Tonight, we're excited to have with us Julian Zelizer, who is celebrating the release of his book, Burning Down the House. Julian is a Malcolm Stevenson Forbes class of 1941 professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University and a CNN political analyst. His most recent books are Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974, co-authored by our moderator, Kevin Kruse, and The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society, which is the winner of the D.B. Hardman Prize for Best Book on Congress. Zelizer has been awarded fellowships with the New York Historical Society, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, and New America. Tonight, Julian will be joined by Kevin Kruse. Kevin Kruse studies political, social, and urban/suburban history in 20th century America. Focused on conflicts over race, rights, and religion, he is particularly interested in segregation and the civil rights movement, as well as the rise of religious nationalism and the making of modern conservatism. His books include White Flight, Atlanta, and the Making of Modern Conservatism, Under One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America, and the recently published Fault Lines. Professor Kruse is honored as one of America's top young innovators in the arts and sciences by the Smithsonian Magazine, and was selected as one of the top young historians in history by the History News Network. He has recently been named Distinguished Lecturer by the Organization of American Historians and by John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship. Tongue twisters today. Without further ado, Julian Zelizer and Kevin Kruse.
Hi there.
Hey there, everybody. Hey, Julian. So we'll have a little chat here and pretend that hundreds of people aren't lurking in the background. It's good to see you. You know, as we just heard, we worked together on a book called Fault Lines, which covered the U.S. history since 1974 to the present. And Newt Gingrich was a big part of that. So I'm excited to dive into his career and your terrific book about him. You know, a lot of people, I think a lot of Americans, probably a lot of the audience, which I see is worldwide, probably only know Gingrich from his time as speaker. He kind of, I think for a lot of Americans, burst on the scene in 1994, but of course he had about 2 decades of political activism and a career in Congress before that. Tell everyone about young Newt Gingrich, or youngish Newt Gingrich, when he started in Congress, that first run for office, what he was like, what he was all about, where he was coming from.
Yeah, this is first welcome to everyone, and thanks for joining us. And it is nice to see people from all over. But Gingrich was quite a character. He had been an army brat. Kind of grew up living in different parts of Europe. His family was originally from right outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, working class area that was Republican. And he ended up in Georgia. He went to Emory. He married his high school math teacher. And he then went to Tulane, where he got a PhD in history and studied colonialism and colonial policy. And then he moved to his first job just as we did, to West Georgia College. And he never really liked academia. Within a year, he wants to be the president of the college and the head of the department. And he runs for Congress. And he's one of the first Republicans in the area you've studied, in a Democratic area. And he's part of that cohort of Republicans who want to make the South red instead of blue, to use our modern color scheme. He's elected in 1978. It's his third try, and he conducts a pretty vicious campaign that gives a taste of what he's going to do. His opponent's someone named Virginia Shepard, and at one point she says in a statement, if she wins, she's going to move to DC. Her husband, her family will still live in the district so they can have their lives. He can have their business. And Gingrich jumps on it and says, look, she wants to break up her family. She's a radical, puts everything above moral values. And it was really a low blow. And he's in Congress, and we can talk about it, but by the early 1980s, he is basically saying Republicans need to do whatever is necessary to finally regain power after being the minority party since 1954. And he starts to do these outlandish and pretty vicious things as part of his partisanship, and he catches people's attention.
So one of the ways he does that, of course, is through this group he's the ringleader of, the Conservative Opportunity Society. I don't think a lot of people know about that. Tell us about the COS.
So he organizes. He's not really an organizer. It's funny. He doesn't care about legislation. He doesn't want to be on committees. He just wants to get his message out. But he is strategic enough to organize. It's basically a caucus of like-minded conservatives who thought he was a visionary and who were willing to do what he did. Like someone named Vin Weber, who was another fellow Republican who was pretty eager to take on the Democrats and stop listening to all these calls for civility and bipartisanship. And so he has this small cohort. The numbers change over time, starts at about 12 people and it will grow. And they're like a team on the House. And when Gingrich has this idea and has a new ploy that he's going to introduce, they're part of that team. And in some ways, they're foot soldiers for the Reagan Revolution. They are the most aggressive bunch. And they're trying to shake up their own party and say, we have to do things in ways that are out of the Washington box if we're going to win.
Right. Well, didn't they have the saying that only two things stand in our way, the Democrats and the Republicans?
Yeah,
right?
No, that's right. And the tension was in much of this period that I write about, the House Minority Leader is this guy named Bob Michael, who's from Illinois. He's a get-along kind of Republican. He's been there for a while, doesn't like to shake the boat. He believes in working with Democrats, and he still believes in bipartisanship. And Gingrich hated him in many ways as much as he hated Speaker Tip O'Neill and then Speaker Jim Wright.
So one of the ways Gingrich gets around that party leadership that's kind of blocking him to get that message out, which, as you note, is all he really cares about, is the media, right? So talk about how Gingrich learned to use the media of the 1980s to get that new message out.
So that's a big part of the book. And this is really before the conservative media world that we know exists. There is conservative talk radio, and it's expanding during my story. Fox News doesn't exist yet. There's no internet websites like Breitbart. So he uses the mainstream media, as it's called today, networks, newspapers, cable television as his tool. And so one of the stories I tell in the book, which I used to tell for everyone listening, Kevin and I taught this class that became Fault Lines, and I would always tell this story. And it's actually when I would tell the story, I realized there's probably a good book here. It was in 1984, and he and his group, a Conservative Opportunity Society, they realized at the end of the day, anyone's allowed to go to the front of the House, the chamber, and make a speech. They're called 1-minute speeches, special order speeches. They're not reserved for people just with power, and anyone can do it. So he and his cabal started going to the floor, and they made these speeches, and they were blistering. They started to say Democrats are weak on defense. Democrats don't support Reagan's war against communism. And with the TV cameras rolling, with this new station, C-SPAN, covering the proceedings, they even named specific Democrats like Eddie Boland of Massachusetts and said, how do you respond to this? What's your answer? And the chamber was silent. And if you were watching on C-SPAN, it looked like the Democrats had no response. But what people couldn't see was no one was in the chamber, because the rules only let you put the camera on the speaker. And so it was political theater at its finest, or worst, depending on your opinion. Tip O'Neill gets so mad, the Speaker of the House, he bursts in, he orders the cameras to pan the chamber and to show there's no one there. But even then, Gingrich turns it against him and says, look, Tip O'Neill breaks the rule. He's an autocrat. He's the part of this corrupt Democratic establishment. And then O'Neill gets even angrier. And he gives this blistering speech, and he says it's the lowest thing he's seen in his career, what Gingrich was doing to the Democrats. And then the Republicans have his words struck from the record, saying the speaker spoke improperly, and it's an embarrassment to O'Neill. And the story culminates with a media angle, meaning all three networks covered this. NBC, CBS, and ABC on the nightly news all had stories about Gingrich, about Cam Scam, about what these young mavericks were doing. And that was what Gingrich ultimately wanted, and he couldn't be more pleased. So there's many stories where he uses the institutions of the media as a way around his own party leaders and to really kind of smear what the Democrats are about.
Excellent. Now, so you mentioned Tip O'Neill, who is, of course, a figure that looms large as kind of Reagan's sparring partner in the 80s. But in kind of a, there's this I guess, somewhat of a myth of the kind of the clubby relationship they had. They would get bourbon together. They were two old Irish politicians who kind of got along after hours. Gingrich blows all that up, right? I mean, so how does Gingrich and the people around him really impact that relationship that Reagan and O'Neill had in both fact and fiction?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fiction to that. O'Neill really didn't like what Reagan was doing to the country and thought he was much too far to the right in terms of economic policy and social policy. But it was true that I think leaders in both parties, the Bob Michaels, the Tip O'Neills, they balanced the partisanship with the needs of governance. And they always were making this trade-off, and that helped them understand, when are you going too far? They didn't want to go so far that they start to destroy the institutions and the procedures and the relationships that were simply necessary to govern. Gingrich said, throw all that out the window. He would write memos to other Republicans saying, enough with bipartisanship, enough with civility. All that means is we're going to keep losing, and Democrats are going to keep having their power. And he writes, Bob Michael, you have to teach Republicans, he says, to be more aggressive, to be more confrontational, to stop negotiating with the Republicans. And this, you know, it starts as he's seen as a McCarthyite, really. That's how people talk about him. But what happens in the 80s, it's kind of interesting. Gradually, more and more Republicans start listening to him. And the more success he has with these tactics, the more intrigued they are by him, because they want to have power. And they start to think of that trade-off, which can be costly in American politics. Do I want power so much I enter into alliances with people I know can be dangerous to the institution?
Mm-hmm. I mean, in a lot of ways, there are parallels between Gingrich's rise and the rise of Lee Atwater, right, as a political strategist in '88. What's their relationship like?
Yeah, it's a very important relationship, and they directly come into contact. So the heart of the book that I hope everyone buys and enjoys from the Strand, but the heart of the book revolves around Gingrich after this Cam Scam incident and after some other conflicts with the Democrats. In 1987, Tip O'Neill has retired, and there's a new speaker in town, Jim Wright, who had been the majority leader. He was from Texas. He was an old school Democrat, and you know, he was a liberal, and he believed he was defending against this Reagan revolution, that the House was the last bastion of Democratic politics. But Wright was a good target for Gingrich, who wanted to focus on this theme that Democrats were a corrupt establishment. That was his consistent theme. And Wright there were stories about him in the press about questionable relations with people in the district, and Wright sold this book that he published of speeches in bulk to groups that he spoke to. And there were these a bit odd stories, or they didn't sit quite right. So Gingrich uses all of these, and he whips Washington up into a frenzy, saying that Jim Wright is the most corrupt speaker ever in American history, with really pretty small stories about misbehavior or questionable behavior. So that's the heart of the story. And then in 1988, this is another time that the party establishment sees the value of Gingrich. Who's running for president? George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president. And in May, his opponent, Mike Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts, is attacking Bush and saying that he's sleazy, that he's part of the Reagan administration, that had Iran-Contra, it had scandal after scandal, and that Bush was part of this. He called it the sleaze factor. So his campaign person was Lee Atwater, and Lee Atwater was putting together a pretty vicious campaign that played on racial backlash and was very much a character assassination kind of campaign. And in May, when Bush is struggling in the polls, he picks up on this story and he convinces Bush to talk about Jim Wright all the time and to take this story that had really still been on the fringes and mainstream it into the campaign. So Atwater saw politics just like Gingrich. It was a blood sport. Character assassination was totally fine. And it was about storytelling. Gingrich was a historian who understood what storytelling was about. Lee Atwater was a fan of professional wrestling, and he thought politics should be run accordingly.
Absolutely. So I want to back up just a little bit because Jim Wright looms large in this. And I think, again, for people who don't follow the story, the thought in the late 80s that there was a House Speaker who was a liberal Texan, Democrat, is going to seem like an anachronism. Tell us a little bit more about Jim Wright, who he was, and how he came into this story.
Yeah, you know, he's this Texan. He's older, born in 1922. Gingrich born in 1943, so he's older. He's very much a Democrat who subscribed to what the New Deal represented, pretty much on board with the Great Society. He did have spotty moments on civil rights issues, votes against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because he believes it's going to cost him his seat. Later apologetic about this and thought it was one of the great mistakes of his career. But by the 70s and 80s, he's pretty liberal. He's a little hawkish on foreign policy, but he accepts most of what FDR through Lyndon Johnson had put together. And so, yes, it's hard to imagine a Texas Democrat like that, but that's who he was. And he very much saw Ronald Reagan as a danger. And this is a counterpoint to some of the mythology of the 1980s. He thought Reagan was pretty right-wing and really taking steps that were dangerous to the fabric of the country. And overseas, he thought Reagan's support of the Nicaraguan Contras, for example, was really misguided, and that there was opportunities to negotiate peace that he actually pursues on his own that Reagan didn't care about. He wasn't someone well-liked personally. Even Democrats didn't like him. He was cold, he was removed, and that hurt him. And he was old school, pre-Watergate politics, meaning he didn't think about how some of the things he did might look in the eyes of the media and in the eyes of Washington. He wasn't corrupt, but he operated in that area of gray that many politicians did, which could be used against them and actually was.
Now, of course, the irony of Newt Gingrich, of all people, lobbying ethics charges at somebody is that Gingrich's own life was, shall we say, riddled with some of its own problems. Talk about that. How did Gingrich's own character issues surface here?
Yeah, he had lots of character issues, and not only did he have them, they were public. They were written about in the media. So I'd say there's two streams of problems that by the time he goes after Jim Wright are known problems. One, his relationships. He had, for example, a pretty difficult divorce with his high school math teacher, and there was a story about it in Mother Jones in 1984, which was trying to capture what Gingrich was like personally. And one of the stories that really caught people's eye was that while his wife was in the hospital for cancer surgery, he came to discuss divorce with her. And in the article, actually kind of whipped out the papers, which wasn't exactly true, although he did have these discussions in the hospital. And he also was known to be someone with a roving eye and who had an affair. And this was known in Washington, and it mattered given he was part of this new conservative movement with the moral majority as its base. And he also had ethics problems. At the time, he is going after Speaker Wright for the charge of unethically selling his books to make money. He himself is being charged with having raised money from interest groups to promote a book that he wrote. And this story actually is in the papers at the climactic moments of this story where he's bringing Jim Wright down. But he doesn't care. I mean, it's a remarkable part of his psychology. When these emerge, he bulldozes right through them and he just says it's different. It's not the same. And he keeps moving forward. Whereas you see with the Democrats, it's much more damaging.
Okay, well, back to Democratic character issues. I think one of the greatest gifts that Gingrich ever got was finally not having a Republican president in office and being able to run against basically a Democratic president in Bill Clinton. So how does Gingrich make hay out of the early years of the Clinton presidency?
Well, that's a good, I think it's a good connection with the two decades. In some ways, Jim Wright comes first and Bill Clinton comes second. And again, one of the most remarkable parts of the book, just to move backwards even, was to realize how consistent and strategic Gingrich was in how he was going to attack the Democrats. He really doesn't focus that much on liberal versus conservative all the time, left versus right. What he really loves is in this post-Watergate America, when there's a lot of distrust in government and a lot of just anger in the electorate, he turns the Watergate story against Democrats. He makes them the establishment. And he keeps coming back to this theme because he thinks it will resonate. It will be his populist message. And Wright is his first takedown. Wright becomes the embodiment, in his mind, of everything he's been saying since 1974. He draws a picture, creates a character, and then brings him down. And I think fast forward to after Bill Clinton is elected, he very much does, or attempts to do the same with Bill Clinton. He made Bill Clinton the embodiment, not so much of a corrupt Democratic establishment. He had moved on to a kind of morally corrupt establishment or a culturally too far left establishment. Whatever he wanted to focus on, I think he then tried to do the same. And I'm sure his experience with Wright emboldened him to say we can move forward with an impeachment and it might very well work.
The big moment for Gingrich, of course, is 1994. Right. So talk about how that campaign takes shape. Was it really a national election? How big a role does the contract with America play? How does Gingrich kind of spin that massive coup?
Yeah, no, it is an important election. And one of the things that Gingrich does is he nationalizes the midterm campaigns very effectively. And he uses the things he learned in the 80s about why the media is useful to his advantage. And so the most famous element of that campaign for everyone who remembers it or studied it is the contract in America, which is really something of a media gimmick. It was a set of promises that Republicans were making that if they won, they would then enact them. That was their first 100 days, so to speak, as a legislative body. It's published as a tear-out sheet in Reader's Guide, meant to be put on people's refrigerators. He has a rally on the steps of the Capitol with other Republicans to talk about the contract with America. So stylistically, you see him continuing to put together this conservative politics with a very media-centered form of politics, with a politics that placed great weight on the stories Republicans were going to tell about their opponents, the language they were going to use. And it's successful. And when Republicans take over in '94, it's a big deal in Washington. it is the first time since 1954, when Eisenhower is in office, that Democrats control both chambers of Republicans control both chambers of Congress. And it's almost the second step of the Reagan Revolution in their minds. And for conservatives, it's a big moment. And finally, that's when Gingrich can bring all the little tools and all the strategies and all the rhetorical weapons he had been working on since the 80s into the very top places of political power as Speaker of the House.
You mentioned language in the 1994 campaign, and that, of course, is one of the really important things, I think, as we've talked about. Talk a little bit about Frank Luntz's memo, with a language, a key mechanism of control. How does that influence not just 1994, but kind of the Republican Party going forward?
That's really, it's a fascinating memo to see, and I think you can still Google it if you want to look at it yourself. Before that memo comes out in 1990, Gingrich's language through the 80s had been pretty remarkable. He called Democrats the loony left. He, basically accused them of unpatriotic behavior. Jim Wright was furious because he said later in life, he made me a criminal. He didn't say I had done shady things. He basically presented me as someone who should go to jail. And he really believed in using blistering language. I mean, one thing, he wanted to shape how people saw the Democrats in a particular way. And he knew by using language like that, the media could not resist covering what he had to say. He used to say that the media likes more Indiana Jones than Philharmonic. And I think he really believed that, and words were the way he gave them Indiana Jones. He gave them the adventure and the thrill. And so this memo comes out in 1990. Gingrich controlled something called GOPAC, which he took over in 1984. It was a defunct political action committee, essentially. And he rebuilt it, and he used it to distribute audio cassettes to Republicans, teaching them what to do, and memos. And this memo in 1990, it was written, and it said to Republican candidates, if you want to speak like Newt, these are the kinds of words that you need to use when talking about Democrats. And it's a list of words like sick, traitor, slime, radical, really words that even today you kind of step back. But it was very important. And I think through Gingrich and through his use of those words, not as a bomb thrower politically, but as a leader, it legitimated this form of talking about your opponents. And just look at a certain Twitter feed and you'll see he won out, and his style still resonates.
Mm-hmm. So Gingrich legitimizes that language. He also legitimizes, to an extent, George H.W. Bush had as well, people like Rush Limbaugh. What's the relationship between, given the Gingrich's kind of manipulations of the media before, when there wasn't a right-wing media, in the 90s when Limbaugh's at his peak, and then Fox News is formed in 96. What's Gingrich's relationship with this new conservative media?
Very close. And so the right scandals taking place when conservative talk radio is flourishing in 87, 88, 89, after the fairness doctrine is dismantled. And Gingrich relies on what hosts are saying about people like Jim Wright. They're very tough on Wright. And they amplify his message. Wright there's an effort to raise congressional salaries in 1989. And so Jim Wright is in the middle of this, and conservative talk radio has a revolt. They call it a Tea Party revolt, by the way. And all over the country, hosts are really lashing out at Wright, and it helps Gingrich in this cause. And Gingrich is, in those years, very tied into conservative talk radio. He had in the 80s guest hosted on a local DC radio show called Confrontation, which was the origins of Crossfire on CNN. But then as he's speaker, he's very close to people like Rush. Literally, they coordinate messages for the day. He depends on conservative talk radio, and then Fox in the tail end of his speakership, especially in 1998 during his battle against Bill Clinton. But what's interesting is he comes first. And I think we often think as conservative media as the origins of this very smash mouth form of rhetoric. But in fact, I think Roger Ailes and some of the founders were already looking at what Republicans had done before they came on the scene and mimic some of them. They mimic that memo in how they broadcast the news.
Talk a little bit about what happens with Clinton's impeachment, which I think Gingrich sees as kind of the, he's finally, Ahab has finally caught the whale, and the way in which, I guess also like Moby Dick, it backfires on Ahab. Talk a little bit about Gingrich's own downfall.
Well, it's a Shakespearean story, I guess, at some level, in that here he is a speaker, here he is bringing together all these tactics, and now he has a cohort of Republicans that's much greater than that congressional opportunity, the conservative opportunity society. It's now the majority is behind him, and he thinks he has the president, and he goes after him. We know what the impeachment is about. It stems from the affair that the president had with Monica Lewinsky, and then when he perjures himself speaking about it. But in the end, it will bring him down rather than Bill Clinton. And at one level, a lot of the politics and the battles exposed that Gingrich had a really pretty fierce temper and wasn't a particularly likable person. But more importantly, in 1998, in the midterms, right in the middle of the impeachment, Republicans do poorly in the midterm elections, and a lot of Republicans are unhappy with Gingrich because of this. And just as important, he is yet in another romance, another affair, as the Republicans are going after Bill Clinton for the same sort of issue. So the Republicans get rid of him. So on the one hand, it's the downfall. On the other hand, it's kind of fitting because he was the one that showed that leaders were not going to have their power very long and that leaders could be brought down. So it was almost predictable that at some point he'd have the same fate.
So where does he stand in kind of the range of speakers? We've talked about O'Neill, we've talked about Wright, Gingrich, the ones that have come after him. Where do you rank? People always want us to rank stuff. Where do you rank Newt Gingrich in, say, the post World War II speakers?
I don't think as speaker, in that particular position, he's not one of the most influential speakers. I think certainly if you compare him with Democrats like Sam Rayburn, who was the speaker for much of the late New Deal through the early 1960s, he was much more consequential in terms of legislation and in terms of some of the big debates of the period. You could argue Nancy Pelosi also has been more consequential. You can argue in some ways John Boehner in transforming the nature of the caucus was pretty important in checking what Obama was doing. I don't think that was his high point. I really think the period before becoming speaker in some ways is when Gingrich's legacy is set. He already has transformed the party before he becomes speaker. He's already popularized and legitimated this new form of Republican partisanship. And speaker is kind of the icing on the cake of what he had already done. And the most important part of the speakership is he institutionalizes all these ideas and he legitimates them. I mean, his being speaker is in itself what would put him at a high place in terms of the ranking, because it signaled there was a new Republican Party in town, and Gingrich was the voice. He was the new establishment himself. So more for that would I say he was very consequential than the legislative battles he fought with Clinton.
Okay, one last question, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A. So if you have a question, please type it in, and I'll ask Julian for you. And this may preempt some of the early questions, but it's one I know you're going to get, and I know it's on everyone's minds. What's Gingrich's connection to the Republican Party and the Trump administration today? His wife is the ambassador. His third wife is the ambassador to the Vatican. He has certainly been kind of a surrogate for Trump on Fox News and conservative radio. How much of a connection do you see between that? Is he glomming onto a movement he had nothing to do with, or is this really the result of what he did?
No, I think I think the latter. I mean, I do think just at a broad level, President Trump has found room in this Republican Party because it's a Gingrich party. So I think a lot of the way Trump approaches his politics, a lot of the verbal kind of record that we have seen from this president, his willingness to just totally break institutions and break procedures and use things that were normal in pretty aggressively abnormal ways, that all comes from the logic of a party that Gingrich helped to build. And so at that level, there's a lot of connection between them. And even this whole thematic focus, constantly you hear from the president on an establishment that's out against conservatives and against him, is something that Gingrich really centered his rhetoric on. But then there's personal connections, such as his wife. Gingrich was one of the final possible selections for vice president. I start the book with that story, where he's being considered. He's in the Indiana meeting with all the top Trump people, family members, and advisors. And in the end, Gingrich goes on Fox television while he's still being considered, and he tells Sean Hannity in an interview, he says, I don't know if I'm going to get picked, because he says, I'm a pirate, President Trump's a pirate, and 2 pirates on a ticket might be too much. And he almost says too much, which is Gingrich, that's not in his own interest to say. And then, so there's that connection. Kellyanne Conway, this I didn't know, was one of Gingrich's top advisors when he ran for president in 2012. And she tried to sell Gingrich in the same themes and messages as Trump, but Gingrich was actually harder to contain and to stay disciplined than Trump turned out to be. And finally,
less disciplined than Donald Trump. Amazing.
Well, right. And since becoming president, as you said, he's been a presence. He is on Fox television all the time, speaking in favor of the president and trying to articulate why this presidency is important. He's written, I think, 5 books now about Trump and about understanding Trump, about why Trump's America is great for the nation, and now a book about why his reelection is so important to our future. He just was praising the monument speech on Fox as really a milestone speech in the country's history. So the two are very, very close, and I'm not surprised, but I'm hoping to explain why this connection is so tight. Awesome.
Let's go to the questions. We have a bunch rolling in, both in the chat and in the Q&A, so I'll read some off. Our first one comes from Ireland. Keen Tormey has a question. Is it safe to say Roger Ailes drew much from Gingrich's wedge issues in defining Fox News that we recognize today, or does that give Gingrich too much credit?
No, it doesn't. I mean, that's a very fair argument. Roger Ailes is a Republican consultant in the 1980s before he does Fox. So he's watching very closely. He's very cognizant of the kind of politics that's working for Gingrich. He's there throughout everything I write about. And I think this is very much on his mind. I mean, Ailes was interested both in producing information that would help the GOP, but also producing conservative information that would attract viewers. I mean, this was important to him. And what he understood was the kind of language he had seen from Gingrich and his allies was functional. So I don't think that's a stretch at all. And again, it's interesting, the sequence. The politicians come first and the media came second, and now they work together in the current period.
Okay. Our next question comes from actually 2 different people who asked basically the same question, both Patty Barnes and Steve, asking you to compare and contrast Gingrich's policies to McConnell's politics. What's their relationship like? Are they on the same page or are they different?
Their personal relationship, I don't know much about, but in terms of how McConnell practices, both when he was minority and as majority leader, I think it's very Gingrich-like, meaning the basic premise of Gingrich partisanship is that partisanship takes precedence over everything. And this was a big step. I know it today sounds obvious, but the idea of putting aside the concerns of governance and putting aside the concerns over whether our institutions will work, that was a big deal to do. And I think McConnell, if you want to understand anything about McConnell, is he thinks about partisan power foremost all the time. And people are always surprised at what he does. whether it's not allowing a Supreme Court nominee to even meet with senators, as we saw during the Obama presidency, or using government shutdowns in the budget process simply as tools for the GOP. That's right out of the Gingrich playbook. I mean, that is the logic of what Gingrich was saying. So I think McConnell's a perfect example, not with the rhetoric. He's quiet. He doesn't like to be the person blasting the words on the floor. But in terms of the procedure, this is the kinds of stuff Gingrich was calling for.
Great. On the flip side, John Katzenberger asked, were there any Democratic members who had a good strategy to combat Gingrich? If so, what was it?
Well, that's an important question. My book's as much about Democrats as Gingrich. And one of the interesting elements of the book is that a lot of Democrats in the 80s didn't really see where this was all going, including Jim Wright. He didn't totally understand what Gingrich was up to, how far he'd go. When Gingrich was lobbing rhetorical bombs at him, saying he's the most corrupt person ever, Wright would answer with like very technical legal explanations of what he didn't violate any laws. And he just didn't understand that reporters were not going to care much about that. They liked hearing Gingrich say most corrupt ever. And finally, at the kind of climactic moment of the Wright story, he didn't have to resign. But what happens, many Democrats are scared and they basically start to pressure him privately to step down, and they start to tell the media maybe he should go. And that was a strategy they thought would work. Wright thought it would work, and it didn't work because the whole point was the Republicans weren't going to stop when this was done, and they kept going. There were a few Democrats who urged their party to be tougher. There was one Democrat, Beryl Anthony, and one Bill Alexander, and they wrote op-eds at the high point of this scandal saying, we have to hit back. We have to tell the public what Gingrich is about. We don't have to have Speaker Wright resign. He should resign. And we have to really fight fire with fire. But the parties are different. I don't think they were willing to do that en masse. And I think that's part of the challenge they faced ever since.
Okay, that leads into another question by Chris Martin here. Is it likely that the Democratic Party will have a speaker like Gingrich or a majority leader like McConnell in the near future?
At some level, no, because I think the parties are different. And people often ask me, why do you have Republicans and why are they so much fiercer in what they're willing to do? And I think there's an answer that goes to what the parties are about. It's not a moral answer, meaning Democrats believe in government. Government's essential to their platform, to their policies, to their whole worldview. And so a partisanship that's so fierce, it undermines the ability of government to work. It undermines the ability of politicians to craft policies. That doesn't work well for Democrats. They're always going to be checked by that fear of destroying what's so important to them. Republicans have at least presented themselves as an anti-government party. In general, they're much more comfortable with a government that's not growing and that's even dysfunctional because it fits. It fits in an anti-government ethos. And dysfunctional government makes sense to them. That's what they're saying it always is. So I think Republicans and future Republicans are much more willing to go there and to take those risks because they're not dependent on Washington working. I mean, we see that right now in the middle of this pandemic. So there'll probably be, look, I do think you can still be a tougher partisan. Being a tough partisan doesn't mean being a destructive partisan. And I imagine younger Democrats, both the AOC types and even some of the Kate Hunter types from 2018, they have now come of age watching this new Republican Party. So I do think they'll be more inclined to be tougher, to use the media more effectively, to hit back when the Republicans attack, but they will never go to the same place. I think the parties are just imbalanced that way.
Okay. Well, that leads into another question we've got here from an anonymous attendee, but it's a good question. It says, the book is about Gingrich, the person and the politician, but can you speak to some of the structural factors that aided his rise?
Yeah, there's lots of structural factors. For example, Republicans are doing well in the 1980s and they're starting to gain steam on Capitol Hill because a lot of the corporate world has set up shop in Washington during the 1970s, and they're starting to redirect campaign funds to the GOP, which under Reagan is much more sympathetic to what they were looking for, to deregulation, supply side tax cuts, and that money is very important to the Republican Party. The Democrats are not pristine. I mean, one of the arguments of my book is because they don't go far enough in the 70s in responding to Watergate, the Democratic Party is structurally filled with problems. I mean, they too are taking a lot of money. They do have relationship with lobbyists, and that's what Gingrich exploits. And you can almost pick any member and say, well, within the system, this person must be wholly corrupt. And that also stems from a structural problem. And since then, since his rise to power and in the years that followed, there's other key structural elements such as the perfection of gerrymandering, combined with a huge national investment by the GOP and state politics to make sure that states like in 2010 were able to really craft districts that would solidify, very red Republicans for the foreseeable future. So structural issues matter, but I did want to tell a story that focused on people and turning points. It was important to me. I mean, I spend a lot of my time, as many of us do, talking about the big factors behind partisanship, how the media changes. We did this in our book, how the parties realign, how voters sort, all of which are crucial. But it's also about individual leaders who push politics in a certain direction. It's about moments like when Jim Wright falls from power that legitimate this new style of politics, which might not have been legitimated if the story turned out differently. So that's why I wanted to tell this in a more human way and really hone in on the individuals who mattered at this moment.
And speaking of partisanship, we have a question here. Could too much partisanship eventually break both parties?
Sure, of course. I mean, partisanship unrestrained is a dangerous thing. Some partisanship's good. It's clearly good to have coherent ideas. I think a lot of people want parties that stand for something rather than just a muddle of watered down ideas. But if partisanship is always the priority, and if both parties go fully in that direction, if they really double down, if the Democrats finally say, everything Zelizer just argued, so be it, we're going all out, you'll destroy the ability of the institution to work. Any semblance we have now of policymaking in the middle of the pandemic, that will be gone. All you will have is totally politicized responses to every crisis we face, whether it's big crises like pandemics and criminal justice reform, or small crises like just passing a budget so that the government could actually pay for what it said they were going to pay for. And that is destructive. I don't believe there's no cost to all-out partisanship.
Assuming partisanship continues, there's a great question here from Vanessa Valdez. Who do you think the Republicans are grooming to be the next Gingrich and or McConnell?
Well, it sounds like Tucker Carlson's going to run for president, so maybe that's our answer. I'm not sure they're grooming people from within. I mean, obviously there are figures like Ted Cruz who still remain, even though they've been somewhat isolated, big voices in the party, kind of cleaned up versions of what Donald Trump is trying to do, but with a little more gravitas. So I think those are still some of the figures I look to. But I don't know, as this continues, I think they are also looking outside traditional politics for the people who are the future. And I say Tucker Carlson kind of as a joke, but our president really came out of the reality television world, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of these outlets are also grounds where they're trying to find new voices for the party. And then, there are younger members like Tim Scott, who I'm sure some Republicans are looking for newer voices who don't simply replicate kind of everything that has been done. But then there's also, and I know I'm giving a lot of answers, the Tom Cottons who, like Ted Cruz, they're Trumpian. They just do it in a more polished way. And right now, I think those are the voices that are being groomed although I'm sure the party is going to look broadly.
We have time for one more, and I'm going to glom my own question onto the end of it because I know the answer to this, but I want to springboard. The question from an anonymous attendee is, did you interview Newt Gingrich yourself? My question is, are you bracing for Newt Gingrich's response to the book?
So on the first question, I didn't. I tried many times, and each time I had a meeting, it was through his secretary, postponed or canceled. And so after several years, I finally gave up. I did have lunch with him many years ago when he was at Princeton, but before I was writing this book with a group of people. But I don't know, more important, his lawyer granted me access to his congressional archives, which are in West Georgia College, which for historians are still the heart and soul of what we do. And his papers were unbelievable. They are the best congressional papers I've ever used. And they have strategy memos, they have handwritten notes from him, they have communication within the party that is the kind of material I usually am searching for and don't find. And it was all there in front of me. So I didn't get to speak to him about the book, but I actually got firsthand all the documentation from the period. I met with Jim Wright. His archives were very good as well. In terms of bracing myself, I don't know. I mean, I write about people who are alive, and so I understand they'll have different interpretations, and I'm sure I could suspect what his view is. I mean, I think at some level he won't disagree with what I wrote, but he will think he did the right thing. And I'm sure, and he said this at the time, he believes Jim Wright was corrupt, and he will hold to that argument. But I'm not bracing myself, but I'm certainly curious how and if he responds. Although right now he's very focused on 220 and his book.
I have no doubt you'll hear from him in time. I want to thank everyone for coming out again. The book is terrific, Burning Down the House. It is not actually a collection of Julian reciting talking head stories. It's about Newt Gingrich, but it's a great title. It's a great book. Andrea put a link for it to buy it from the Strand. Let's try to buy from the Strand, who hosted this event. It's in the chat room there. You can get it. And I'll turn it back over to Andrea. But thank you all for coming out, and thanks, Julian.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was so wonderful and so much information in an hour. Like, I love it. Julian, do you have any final, I know you're just beginning to start sharing your book. It was just published. Any like thank yous or hellos or anything you'd like to send out before we sign off?
Yeah, just thank you to the Strand, and thanks to Kevin, and thanks to you, Andrea, and everyone who put it together. And obviously, thanks. Every book, if you write a book, has a team behind it. And I have a great team of editors and publicists. And obviously, thank you to my family, which has been instrumental to allowing me and helping me do this.
Perfectly said. Yeah, thank you both again so much for this evening. It's been really wonderful. Thank you everyone who's been watching either here or on Facebook. You've been really participatory and it's been really fun. So thank you for that. And I'd like to just wish you all have a great evening.
Thank you, you too. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.